Good evening. My name is Mira Thompson, and on behalf of my fellow artists at Atlantic Gallery, I'd like to welcome you to this panel discussion of our exhibition, Or Curse the Darkness. The pieces in the exhibition represent different responses to this present moment in history, and all of them assert our freedom of speech. Not all of the artists who contributed to this show are able to be here tonight, but many of us are. We invite you to spend time in the exhibition after the discussion and to enjoy some refreshments. We would be happy to meet you. We're wearing name tags. We are extremely grateful to Dr. Roberto Ferrari for organizing and moderating tonight's proceedings. I will say a few words about Dr. Ferrari, and he in turn will introduce his fellow panelists. Roberto C. Ferrari is the curator of art properties at Columbia University, where he oversees the permanent art collection of work in all media and time periods from around the world. He holds a PhD in art history from the CUNY Graduate Center and specializes in 18th, 19th, and early 20th century American and European art. He was the guest curator and juror for the Atlantic Gallery's 2014 exhibition, Off the Grid. His articles and reviews have been published in numerous journals, and he has taught art history courses at a number of institutions, most recently an undergraduate seminar on public outdoor sculpture at Columbia. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Ferrari.
Thank you, Mira, for that wonderful introduction. That was very kind of you. We want to make sure that we're working with the technology. Are we doing okay with the sound? Okay, all right. And I guess this is going to be a very interesting evening because as we're doing our roundtable discussion, it's also open gallery night. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people coming in and out. So we hope that as more people come in, they're going to be engaged with a lot of the conversations that we're going to hear this evening. In addition, I just want to also just officially say a big thank you to the Atlantic Gallery. All of the artists in the show, all of the artists who are part of the gallery, and of course the staff here, Martha in particular, for really inviting us to be a part of this and have the opportunity to work with the artists in tonight's presentation. I also want to thank my fellow panelists, who you will meet momentarily. The name of the exhibition is Or Curse the Darkness. And it derives from a Chinese proverb that goes something like this. And I'm going to say it in English, not Chinese, because I don't speak Chinese. But in English, it goes something like this. It is better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. However, this particular phrase, this aphorism, has been sort of reinterpreted within the context of this. Jeff Miller, the vice president of Atlantic Gallery, is credited with the one who sort of came up with the title for the show. This idea being that in this current political crisis, there really is an emotional sense of response for many artists, particularly when we have things like the NEA, for instance, the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as many other entities that are being proposed to be completely wiped out. And what does this say about the current, as just one tiny microcosm of the bigger picture of what's happening? Some of us are aware of just the news a couple of hours ago about the current administration claiming that we're pulling out of the Paris climate environmental meeting as well. So a lot of things that many of us are feeling, an array of emotions. I don't even want to begin to name them because we could be here just doing that. But I think the interesting part about the way this exhibition has developed is that every single artist in this show has a different response. And some of it may be a little bit, they just vary. And it does range. Robert Forte's paintings have a very highly expressionistic sensibility of a sort of virulence in the way they're reacting to some of the perhaps anger and anxiety of the moment. And then there are other works like Joan Walton's ceramic vessel that you see near the other end of the room, which seems to actually convey more of a sense of hope, a sort of idea that, the sort of the rainbow behind the storm cloud idea. So again, this idea that we have many different ways of interpreting and thinking about how we may react and respond to these things. We're really thrilled to be here, and we're part of a bigger community here of people interested in art, whether we're creators, art historians, art critics, or just lovers of art. It's really about that's bringing us together and how we're dealing with the crisis as it is today. And so this idea of the power of political protest art, I thought I would just start off by introducing something that's been very much in the news the past couple of days, and we have a PowerPoint running up here. Some of you, I'm sure, recognize this image that's been flashing all over the news the past couple of days, but if you're not familiar with it, it's an image of the comedian Kathy Griffin holding a decapitated head of the president in her hand, and this is a photograph that's by Tyler Shields. Now, let me just mention that Tyler Shields, if you're unfamiliar with him, he is a photographer whose work he's sort of an enfant terrible and enjoys sort of that mindset. He likes to play with commercialism, and he likes to push the envelope with some controversial imagery, but of course everybody in Hollywood loves him, so this is perhaps not too surprising. It is interesting to read in his bio, though, that he himself has said that he's interested in naturalism and the shock of artists like Caravaggio, the Baroque artist, in how he appropriates some of his imagery. And I think that's a sort of interesting twist that we'll come back to momentarily. But Kathy Griffin, of course, is a comedian, and whether you want to argue that she is an artist or not, again, I think the bigger issue here is when you look at an image like this, I think we can all agree that this is performance art, and that, quite frankly, she is making a political statement in her feelings and her frustrations and anger, as many people have, in many ways, that they try to create this image. And of course, not surprisingly, there was a tweet. And this is the tweet. Kathy Griffin should be ashamed of herself. My children, especially my 11-year-old son, Barron, are having a hard time with this. Sick. Always appeal to the kids. It seems to also, create the response. Now, before I go further, I do want to say something. I'm not a practicing artist, but I will say this. I have had my own particular word-based protest ever since the election. The night of the election, as I particularly was sitting there practically in tears watching what was happening, I had a moment where I realized I could no longer say the individual's name. And ever since then, and in perpetuity, I will never say his name, because I will no longer give credence or power to something that I personally see as a sort of form of corruption. Now, again, this is my personal opinion, and this is sort of the whole point of why we're all here. There are many different feelings, reactions, responses to this moment. And whether you agree with it or disagree with it, whether you see it as a negative thing, a positive thing, whatever, the fact is we are all having a reaction and response, and really this is what this is about. So, political protest art, that's what we're here to talk about. Curiously, though, this image of holding the president's head as a sort of decapitated image turns out not to be original with Kathy Griffin. It turns out an artist named Thomas Chung just did this painting at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. Thomas Chung is an assistant professor there. He has his MFA from Yale University, and he's well decorated with numerous awards and accolades. This painting he exhibited, it's life-size. What it is a depiction of a naked Chris Evans, nothing wrong with that perhaps, in the guise of Captain America, his Marvel Comics role, holding the severed head of the president, and clutching to his leg is Hillary Clinton in a sort of image of her as when she appeared in her younger years, sort of playing up the superhero poster art. Of course, if you recognize canonical art, though, you may see that this is tying into Canova's Perseus with the head of Medusa that's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, in addition to another version of it at the Vatican. And I just think what's interesting about this is that it was on exhibition. This was a faculty exhibition, and he put this on display. And interestingly, there was no commentary about it until about the last 4 days of the exhibition. Someone heard about it, saw it, and suddenly it was all over the news, at least in the whole Pacific Northwest, and Fox. And there was controversy. Interestingly, they did not close the show. They did not take the painting down. The show was ending in a few days anyway. So it's just interesting, though, to bring this in, that this image, of course, has already been perpetuated. And as I mentioned, we know already that the iconography we're looking about is all part of art history. It's the Perseus holding the head of Medusa, this idea of the great valiant hero who takes the head of the femme fatale, the destructive female force, and is going to eradicate it. What's interesting is, for all of the upsetment and angst that the president had in his tweet, and other people, justifiably perhaps for some of them, to that photo of Kathy Griffin, what is interesting to me is, after the election, there was a lot of imagery like this that no one seemed to object to, whereby he was personified as Perseus and Hillary Clinton became Medusa. But I want to suggest that it's not even just the bloody nature or the suggestion of what we're seeing that is at issue here. The controversy is also an inversion of the Perseus myth. When you look at Kathy Griffin in her lovely blue dress with a little bow at the top, and she stands there holding this severed head, it is the tradition iconographically in art of Judith and Holofernes. The sort of aggressive woman, the woman who takes control in order to enact and get rid of violence. For those of you unfamiliar with the myth, Judith, it comes from one of the apocryphal books of the Old Testament. Judith was a beautiful widow. Holofernes was a Babylonian general who was invading the area. She went into the camp during the night, got him drunk, and cut his head off and brought it back to sort of rally the troops, if you will, in order to actually defeat the Babylonians and therefore keep their hometown. So this is the imagery that we're talking about, is an inversion. And when you consider that this is a president who we have heard documented on TV, talking about grabbing pussies, making fun of women because of their physical attractiveness, of depending on what their weight or anything about them, there does seem to be something perhaps going on here with this image of Kathy Griffin holding this head that takes it to a different level, that it's not just because it's the head of the president, it's also this inversion of gender politics as well, and this idea of the empowered female in the same way that perhaps one could argue that Hillary Clinton was the empowered female who was the leading contender for the Democratic National Party. So I just wanted to kind of wrap up this little introduction by just pointing out some of the ramifications of what's happened here. It's interesting that Chung, again, nothing really happened for him, although he did claim that, this is what he believed in. He thought it was a good way to represent his particular opinions and feelings about what had happened with the election. In contrast, though, in the past couple of days, Kathy Griffin made big apologies for the image. She claims that she realized she went too far. A lot of people, including Chelsea Clinton, even declared what she had done as being completely inappropriate and vile. And let me just say, I'm not necessarily here to defend or say what is right or wrong, as much as I'm presenting it just for discussion as a form of political protest art. The big news, of course, is that she's been fired from CNN's New Year's Eve bash, so she's not doing that anymore. But it does seem interesting to me that, again, you see gender politics at play, because here is now a woman who enacted this, who then felt the need to apologize for her own political statement, and she's being blasted now and, being reprimanded for not being ladylike in her actions. So it's an interesting sort of backlash as to what's happened at the same time. The other part, though, that I think is really important for us to think about, too, is both of these people, though, Kathy Griffin, interestingly, not the photographer, by the way, but Kathy Griffin and the painter, Chung, both of them did receive a number of death threats, whether it was online or in person or through telephone messages. Chung talks about that people left death messages, voicemails on his voicemail for him. And I will point out that there are other nations in this world that we know that art like this, or art like we see on the wall, can actually lead to your arrest and your death from the government. The good news is, this is the United States, and you cannot be prosecuted at the government level and sentenced to death for expressing how you feel politically through your art. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind and make sure that that doesn't change as things continue to evolve, as time continues day by day, as the way things stand right now politically in this country. So I just want to stop right there as a sort of general introduction and begin our panel and let you hear from our other speakers. So our next speaker is James Saslow, who is a professor emeritus of art history from the City University of New York and the author of 5 books. His work focuses on the Italian Renaissance and Baroque period, with special interest in gender and homosexuality. A founding member of CLAGS, the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies at CUNY, a former national co-chair of the Queer Caucus of the College Art Association, and a board member of the Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art, Saslow has been writing and lecturing about historical and contemporary arts connected to LGBTQ experience for over 40 years. His pioneering survey book, Pictures and Passions, A History of Homosexuality in the Visual Arts, received 2 awards from the Landa Literary Foundation. Welcome, Jim.
Hi. We're so accustomed nowadays to the constant media barrage of partisan political satire and propaganda that it might help to start by remembering that art as a vehicle for social protest could not emerge until the dawn of modern society, modern in the historical sense of the Renaissance to the present. In earlier pre-industrial societies, a very small elite always controlled the limited apparatus of image making and opinion, and so the vast majority of people who couldn't read anyway had no access to images other than those promulgated by the wealthy and the powerful. So it's revealing that the earliest work of social protest that I know about is actually an alphabet letter. It's one of a set of inexpensive prints, probably made to aid ordinary folk in learning how to read. And these were marketed at the exact moment when Gutenberg introduced the printing press to Europe, opening up an ever-increasing access for middle and lower classes to knowledge and news. And not surprisingly, as soon as these classes had an opportunity to express their own views, their images diverged dramatically from the upper crust. The letter Q here is made up of 2 knights on horseback who are battling each other with lances. But the real focus is the 2 literally downtrodden peasants at the bottom who are being trampled and eaten by the soldiers' mangy horses. And so this print gives a bottom-up view of the grim realities of war for its civilian victims. It's helpful to contrast it to another view of warfare in this luxury illustration made for a powerful ruler of the time. The Duke of Berry and his fabulously wealthy court are feasting in splendor, and behind them you see a whole army of white-helmeted knights sally forth from the romantic castle in colorful regalia to what they see as a bloodless battle between fairy tale heroic princes, not the way other people saw the image. As the potential audience expanded for this kind of art, these prints became more explicit, and they also began to suffer censorship, which was an acknowledgement of how effective they were. This example illustrates a Dutch proverb lamenting how the powerful always prey upon the weak, which was a sensitive topic at the time when the little Netherlands was fighting for independence from powerful Spain. Many smaller fish are tumbling out of the mouth of this enormous beached one, and in the foreground boat, a man points out the moral to his son, gesturing toward the action, and his message is conveyed by the title inscription at the bottom, given in both Latin and Dutch for ordinary, uneducated people. Though the print is based on a drawing by Pieter Breughel, it was signed with the name of Hieronymus Bosch, who happened to have died 50 years earlier. The publisher had two motives for this. Number one, he could charge more money for something that was ostensibly by a famous old master. But probably more important, he was concealing the real artist's identity in case the Spanish officials decided to come after him. Social critique in art came into its own in the 19th century, particularly after the liberal revolutions of 1848, which gave birth to Karl Marx in politics and socially minded realism in art. The founding realist, Gustave Courbet, shocked the Paris establishment with sympathetic images of exploited workers and peasants, whom he dignified by giving them the heroic size and monumentality that had formerly been reserved for aristocrats and gods. These two ragged men breaking stones for paving implicitly attack the poorly paid, back-breaking roadwork that has turned the older man bent and robotic with the years and dooms the younger one to a similar endless future. At its debut in the Salon exhibition of 1851, conservative art critics quickly grasped the picture's radical critique of bourgeois capitalism, and it attracted the most attacks from writers and caricaturists. So did the artist himself, who was active in leftist politics and eventually had to flee government persecution to exile in Switzerland. This final example is particularly timely because this is the 30th anniversary of ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. ACT UP formed in 1987 to bring attention to the AIDS crisis and the federal government's neglect through direct political action. The curator at the new museum, William Olander, was an ACT UP member himself, and he invited the group to create this installation in the museum's storefront in Soho, which was designed by the activist art collective called Grand Fury. The multimedia display publicized shocking statistics about government inaction and homophobia, and included cardboard cutouts shaming public figures who had made chilling anti-gay statements. Now, unfortunately, since both social injustice and protest art are both still with us, even after all these centuries, it's worth pondering in conclusion, does it do any good? Sometimes, happily, the answer is yes. The Dutch did eventually win independence, and French workers are now guaranteed generous job conditions. And our government did finally recognize and help AIDS. But it almost doesn't matter whether protest art achieves its immediate practical goals, because it also serves a long-term moral function of bearing witness. Decades from now, looking back on this dismal Trump era, people will know whether our current protests worked or not. They will look back at works like those in this exhibition, seeking answers to other questions. How did you feel about the crises of your time? What did you say? And where did you stand?
Our next speaker is Marisa Lehrer. She's an assistant professor of modern and contemporary art at Manhattan College. She received her PhD from the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and she's been honored with fellowships from the Fulbright, NYU's Le Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, my French is terrible, I apologize, and CUNY's Center for Place, Culture, and Politics, among others. She specializes in Latin American and Latinx art, public art, and memorials, and has curated exhibitions on contemporary protest and reimagining the monument. Her current book project investigates patronage and artistic strategies for memorializing Argentina's victims of state-sponsored terrorism. Welcome, Marisa.
So first of all, I wanted to thank Roberto and Atlantic Gallery for inviting me to be here with all of you today, and to my fellow panelists, and a very large thank you to all of the artists who participated in Or Curse the Darkness. You've given me, and I know everyone else here, a lot to contemplate. So as Roberto mentioned, I am a professor of modern and contemporary art, and one of the topics that comes up often in my classes and questions from my students are, what can art actually do? Can art affect change? And one of the answers I give them is a response that that artist Jeremy Dean had given me when he had said, you know, art is there to cause headaches. Artists aren't necessarily legislators, they're not necessarily politicians, but artists are here to cause headaches. And I think all of the artists in this exhibition are offering some kind of headache to the viewer. But I also wanted to think about, and I often offer up suggestions to my students about ways that artists engage with their political moment to not just give us headaches, but also to affect direct action and direct change. And so what I'm showing you here are images of what it was like to be on the street in Argentina in the 1970s and 1980s, when Argentina was under a military dictatorship. And the first three images, looking up at the top and then on the bottom left, are of Argentina's dictatorship. But does anyone recognize the bottom right image?
So yes, protest in front of
The Turkish embassy. Yeah, so this happened just a few weeks ago here in the States, and I am by no means comparing Argentina's dictatorship to our current political climate, but it is something to think about how we exist in public space and where our freedoms are in terms of protest. And so what I wanted to share with you were some works of art that artists created in the context of the dictatorship and in the context of a public space that was closed to protest, but where human rights organizations and artists pushed back to make the public sphere democratic again. So these are images and photographs of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, who are human rights groups that are comprised of mothers whose children were disappeared by the military dictatorship in the 1970s and 1980s. And human rights organizations estimate that there are about 30,000 disappeared individuals during this time. And mothers who, many of them were previously apolitical, and I think we're finding that in our moment as well, people who may have been previously apolitical, or at least not politically active, are turning to the streets, are turning to ways of protesting our current moment. And I often look back to these women who essentially were oftentimes in the domestic realm and staying in the domestic realm, who then found themselves compelled to take on a more political public space. And one of the ways they protested was by donning these photographs and portraits of their disappeared children. So they would carry them in placards or actually wear them almost as if they were this enlarged locket of a disappeared loved one. And this idea of using portraiture as protest is something that was picked up by other artists that I'll discuss in our more contemporary moment. But so imagine the strength and bravery that these women had collectively to fight the dictatorship in the 1970s and 80s. But eventually, when the dictatorship fell in 1983, many of the military leaders were either given pardons, presidential pardons, or there were amnesty laws that were passed under the democratic governments that basically gave them a free pass. They were essentially allowed to walk free. And so Grupo de Arte Callejero is an art collective that paired with a human rights organization called Heures, which essentially were children of disappeared parents in the 1990s. And they formed their organization in 1995. And this group of Grupo de Arte Callejero translates to group of street artists. And so they took their kind of creative visual aesthetics and coupled them with what the needs were in the 1990s for the children of the disappeared. And what the children of the disappeared wanted was justice and punishment for the perpetrators of crimes against humanity. And you can see on the bottom left, there's a sign that they painted, Juicio y Castigo, which essentially means that, justice and punishment. And they made sure that they took up space in the public sphere. And they created these, what they call escraches, which were essentially what we would call today social practice art or community engaged art, where they used actual, as opposed to using just portraits of the disappeared, they used portraits of the perpetrators. And this, so for example, in the top left there is a portrait of Ricardo Scacco Medica, and he was targeted by Grupo de Arte Callejero, among other military leaders, doctors who participated in torture, anyone who was involved with the dictatorship but that was essentially given a free pass to walk in society were targeted. And so they would plan these times, in this case Saturday, August 3rd at 2:30, people from around 300 to 500 people would gather in front of this person's house. And essentially these were protests that were loud and active. People would chant and sing, and they would make sure that the perpetrator was noticed in their neighborhoods. So even before the actual escrache happened, even before this kind of artistic aesthetic protest action happened, they would pass around flyers. They would essentially flyer the neighborhood with questions that would say, did you know that your neighbor was a torturer? How do you feel about working with him, or serving him lunch, or selling him cigarettes? And so they would basically make it impossible for this person to walk freely in the public sphere. They also did other actions. So on the upper right, there is, if you look in the background, there's like Wednesday at 11 o'clock, what I presume is a news show. And over that advertisement, they plastered a map that says, here live people who committed genocide. So it's essentially a map of Buenos Aires and shows exactly where perpetrators of crimes against humanity live. So they subverted this idea of surveillance that was in existence under the dictatorship and used it against the perpetrators of crimes against humanity. And they would march to their homes and oftentimes they throw red paint that you can see in the bottom right at their homes so that there'd be at least a temporary marker of their bloodied hands. And when the homes were up in penthouses, they would rent cherry pickers and do the same thing, rise up with these images, these portraits of the disappeared, throw the red paint at the perpetrator's home, and then release these flyers of images and of the perpetrators of crimes against humanity along with their crimes. And this very much reminded me of Pieter Treiber's work that also kind of points out the portrait of our current president, but also the lies that he has perpetuated and kind of calls out his wrongs. So unfortunately, I'm showing you a historic image of the protest on the left in Argentina. On the right is a more contemporary image where the mothers and human rights organizations continue to gather and protest the disappearances today. But disappearance isn't really relegated to Argentina, or tragically isn't relegated to our past. It's also something that's occurring right now in the Middle East. On the bottom right, I'm showing you an image from a protest that's protesting the 2014 Iguala, Mexico kidnappings. And Ana Teresa Fernandez is an artist who, in response to these portraits of these students who were essentially kidnapped by order of the Iguala mayor for trying to protest, Ana Teresa Fernandez creates a work of art that's both video, performance, and painting, that's sort of this intermedia, multimedia work, where she essentially uses her own body and paints and drips this black acrylic paint to erase her physical form in protest against the disappearances. And Ana Teresa Fernandez also extends to examining issues of erasure beyond the human body and beyond disappearance, but also to the idea of the border between the US and Mexico, as we all know, has been a prominent has been a prominent political issue the past couple years. And so what she does here is she actually physically erases the border by subverting traditional landscape painting. And here she creates this kind of performance where if you look right in the middle, she paints the border blue between San Diego and Tijuana. She paints it blue and white to kind of blend in, and there becomes this kind of opening where she is both erasing the border but then opening up the possibility of space between the US and Mexico. And I wanted to use Ana Teresa Fernandez's work as a way of talking about Anita Arellano's work. Her work, right behind us in the corner, actually deals with the idea of the border as well. And she creates a portrait of a Latinx family who is essentially celebrating Veterans Day. But if you look closely in the bottom left, there is a very ominous presence, and where we essentially see these shadows of individuals holding guns. And this shadow can both be perhaps the actual presence of these gun holders that are essentially holding up what would be someone who served for our country. And she really questions this idea that's been part of the political rhetoric in terms of who is American enough, who is part of our national identity. And this actually reminded me quite a bit, if you're familiar with Goya's The 3rd of May, 1808, and this idea of these like faceless guns, and these kind of industrialized people that are holding up our citizens, our innocent citizens. And so Arellano is also suggesting, what I think she's suggesting too, is the shadow that people are now living under the Trump administration, whether there's a physical gun or this kind of shadow of violence just because of who someone is. So whether it's the Latinx community or the Muslim community or beyond, there is now this kind of shadow of violence that follows people. And so what I would encourage you as you're examining the exhibition or as you're thinking about art and political protest is to think about some of the receptacles of resistance that the artists in Or Curse the Darkness have offered. So something as three-dimensional as a physical receptacle, like Joan Walton's Water of Life, to something kind of more of a metaphorical receptacle of resistance, like Sally Brady's landscape as the storm worsens. So I think that artists have a lot of headaches to offer us, and I think they have a lot of possibilities of affecting change as well.
Our third speaker is Amara McLaughlin. She is a PhD candidate studying modern and contemporary art at Columbia University. Her dissertation focuses on post-Civil War artists and art spaces in modern-day Beirut, Lebanon. She has taught Columbia's core art history class for a number of years and is currently an intern in the Department of Art Properties at Columbia University. Welcome, Amara.
So I thought I would start today with Guernica as a way to sort of think about how art responds to a specific moment and then can even continue to respond to similar moments for the rest of its life, really. So, I mean, we're at 80 years here with Guernica, and people are still responding to it. The bombing of Guernica happened on April 26th in 1937. Guernica was a Basque country village. It was bombed by Nazi Germany and the fascist Italian warplanes at Franco's request. Picasso actually started this large-scale mural a number of days later, so really in the moment. And he finished it, I think, around June 4th, so it took him about a month to go forward. So we actually have pictures from Dora Maar, who basically photographed Picasso's process throughout this entire time. So we have an image here that shows things that he later removed from the work. But another thing that he moves on to include in his final work that stays and is really, I think, sort of absolutely essential to understanding this work, the importance of this work, are the central horse figure. We have these references that simulate newsprint. And we can also find that in his earlier collage works where he's used newsprint, you can see here too, in this case to sort of show the transparency of the glass material and the atmosphere. And he sort of used that on the body of the horse here as well. And this is sort of really important in that it's referencing the fact that at this point in history, the horror is sort of known to the general population of the world, even through newsprint, through newspaper reports. So we didn't have images the way we might have now, but we certainly had knowledge of what was going on, and he's sort of included that here, which again really shows the moment that he's in, and that you can't really hide from the fact that these things are happening. So yeah, I mean, what does it mean to create political art in the age of mass media? This is really Picasso's response. And I thought, I mean, that sort of connects to some of the works we can see in this room as well. Even Pieter Treiber's here. I mean, I think a number of us probably very recently held signs that were just like this, or have certainly seen images of them. So we have a number of works here that sort of incorporate those kinds of things as well. I'll flip on. Okay, so this work has been reproduced on a number of occasions, and it toured the world for a long time. It was at MoMA for a while. This tapestry was actually commissioned by Nelson Rockefeller because he wanted to buy it from Picasso, and Picasso was like, no, and this is staying in Spain eventually, you can't buy it. So he had this tapestry made. And the tapestry hung in the United Nations Security Council for a long time, and quite famously, actually, I mean, we have this one image I'll just show of Negroponte and other U.S. officials here before they were, on their way to talk about the Iraq War. But quite famously, we have Colin Powell at his testimony at the UN for why we need to invade Iraq and start the war. They decided to cover this image with blue drapery, a curtain basically, and the argument was that the camera people said that they had to have a more neutral background and they couldn't have this, but there was this intense reaction by people watching that they were kind of horrified that this image, which would maybe remind people of the atrocities of war, like the reasons maybe why we shouldn't go into Iraq, had to be covered before he gave this speech. And so a number of artists actually took this idea up, and sadly I could not find an image of it, but there's an artist collective named Making Art Work in Los Angeles had a billboard up that had the blue curtains starting to drape it as sort of a message on censorship and just, we could also say just the power of images in general. So, another protest that happened in front of this work was in 1970 when the Art Workers Coalition had first wanted to, MoMA was helping to fund, a poster they wanted to make that was in protest of the Vietnam War. And at a certain point, MoMA pulled out, and they said, actually, this isn't really one of the functions of a museum. And really it was because the trustees, there was a conflict of interest because a number of trustees on their board supported the Vietnam War. So then MoMA was no longer able to fund this poster, which you could see small, probably not very clearly, but you can see small versions of them here. And basically it was images from the My Lai massacre in Vietnam of a number of, a group of bodies, basically. So they had gotten funding from somewhere else, and at a certain point, they staged this protest at MoMA where they showed their posters in front of Guernica, because what better piece of artwork than this one to sort of put your own poster in conversation with. So just as a sort of reminder of, we've already learned some of these lessons, and here we are repeating them again. Okay, so this also sort of brings us to another protest at a museum that's a little bit more recent. In 2015, a group called Gulf Labor, which is also an artist coalition collective, stormed the Guggenheim and threw banners down and displayed a sign that basically, well, I think it's a little bit blurry here, but it says "Meet Workers' Demands Now." And this was really protesting the working conditions for migrant laborers at the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, also the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, and a number of other places. And the tourism and development investment company that was sort of in charge of everything in Abu Dhabi. And I'll just give you a picture of the island. These are all buildings that were supposed to go up in Abu Dhabi on Saadiyat Island, which is the island of happiness, basically for tourism. So we have this round building here is the Louvre. It's under construction. Abu Dhabi, probably the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi probably will not actually take place, and partly this is because of the work of Gulf labor. So they had decided to do a series of artworks, one artwork for 52 weeks, where they would sort of protest the labor conditions that this museum was being built upon. And basically this happened because there was a workshop, kind of like the one kind of like the talks we're even having now, where they had invited Andrew Ross, who's a professor at NYU, to come and speak about labor conditions and stuff. And Andrew Ross, at a certain point, turned to the audience that was full of artists and said, this was in Lebanon and Beirut, well, what are you guys doing about this? They were like, what are we? What could we do about it? And the Guggenheim was actively trying to collect work from Middle Eastern artists to show it at the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi. And they were like, well, we can, number one, not give our works. So that was the first thing that they did. And then they formed this group and wrote a list of sort of demands of what the workers would need, and they tried to work with the Guggenheim. At a certain point, this got cut off, but at the moment, the project is stalled, and it's kind of sad that it isn't going to happen. But at the same time, it was sort of a triumph that at least, they were able to make a difference. And this is my last image that I'll end on, is actually, the Arabic script is a list of artists' names, the old Lebanese artists' names, that Walid says he has been told by someone from the future is communicating with him, and they tell him these names, and he has to write them down. But they purposely tell him the wrong spelling of certain names so that he'll have to spray red paint and then correct the spelling. And this is because Walid says, given all the catastrophes that are going on in the world right now, the color red itself was so afraid it had to sort of hide and take refuge, and it's therefore not available to people in the future. So we are in this parafictional world. So even colors and lines are being affected and taking refuge and are lacking later in life. And so yes, this is one of the ways they restore it. So yeah, I guess I can end there since I've gone over my 7 minutes. But thanks for having me.
When I attended the opening of this show, my eye immediately went to this work, because it's not only one of the most elaborate works in the exhibition, but also one of the most complex and, I think, profound. There's a continuous leitmotif across all the panels, which is the American flag, and it's a very highly charged symbol that also appears in other works around the exhibition. And here, the flag is sometimes hung backward, evoking the traditional distress signal of a flag upside down, and it seems to keep fading away or fragmenting as if it's endangered or dying. The word prayer in the title of the work alerted me to a plea for some correction of this threat to our national identity. Altogether, it's a 7-panel work, which also recalls the medieval Renaissance altarpiece called a polyptych in its format as well as its title. In other words, many related images grouped together to imply a larger spiritual narrative. And that narrative is implicitly about a national crisis, certainly the mood of this cultural moment. But the story's complicated, and its overall meanings are not fully spelled out, which is what marks this work as a piece of art rather than propaganda.
I was struggling to paint something specific about how I felt about the current political situation. And everything I came up with didn't express what I really feel, which is the disaster that is coming. So I had painted this before, and it seemed to express to me, I painted something ominous in the future. So that's why I decided to include it in this. this exhibition. I thought it expressed it more clearly than the dead flowers I was painting. You know, I just couldn't come up with an image that felt the way I really feel about the horror of the situation.
The two works are really quite different. I mean, my style is obviously very bold and colorful. This is a much more personal work. This is really integrate something that's going on inside of me that is being then transmuted into a political statement. The primal nature of the figure, which is reptilian, is making a very crude gesture, is expressing something that is really revolving and moving, is what I think about the times, and it's also what's going on inside. I mean, I don't want to admit too much about what's going on inside of me. You can read into it, but there is a tremendous amount of turmoil. And that is what I feel, and that is what I feel inside, and that is what I feel about what is going on. There are some very obvious comments as well, besides the gesture. There is the hidden absence of eyes. There is the sense of, I promise you the sun and the moon, and I give you this instead. It's also an expression of his ego, which is all-consuming. This person. I also can't say his name. This is a much more schematic work. This one emerged from ideas that were just going on. The Muslim figure, the auto de fe of religious persecution, breaking the promise of democracy, the flag folds off. And of course, the figure of grotesque head of Trump being pulled as a puppet would be pulled. But central to it all, besides the wall, is the running figure, which has all of the movement, all of the sense of anxiety, but it's also skewered by the lines of the wall and I guess by the lines of all of these lines here. And this is sort of a hellish burning up from underneath. And a breaking of the flag not only there, but red, white, and blue in this autocratic hand, which I sort of thought was maybe the Russian influence of pulling the Trump strings. And, so that's my analysis.
Before the election, but after most of the campaign, I thought of one of the images I had made recently as a fine art image, and it was at an amusement park with a ride called Chaos, spelled with a K, and there is some significance there. Then, of course, the Republicans had completely come unglued, and you know the rest. All the 16 other candidates were all trashed. Trump trying to fly above the whole thing in a red star on the tail of the plane, a symbol of Soviet. So that was early work in the fall, before the election. This is the second piece I created, and there's a lot of layers here. If you stand here and study it, you'll probably see them all. But the central exploding figure is Mr. Trump himself. But in the background of everything is Steve Bannon. And he has two eyes. One of them is Steve Miller, and the other is Kellyanne Conway. So Kelly, Steve, and of course the traditional symbol of distress, the American flag upside down, the chopped up green cards from this crazy ban on Muslim immigrants and visitors and so forth. And of course the protests. So I added this later. This whole piece was finished, and I have upside down Republican and Democratic symbols in here. And the third piece I did in response to the Women's March on Washington was the two behind me. And in the end, I decided to add it to that image.
As I mentioned, this is a work about a Latinx family and an anonymous family in an anonymous town, but it really speaks to some of the issues around our current political moment in terms of who gets to say that they're American and what role each citizen has in our society. So in this case, Arellano is essentially celebrating a Latinx veteran who served his country, but at the same time she offers us this shadow of a very ominous threat of 3 shadowed figures holding guns. And that threat is both, I think, very physical and in a very, very physical threat, but also a metaphorical threat. And it essentially symbolizes, at least to me, the shadow of kind of surveillance that exists in our contemporary moment around people who are either American or who are considered un-American. And she really calls into question who we kind of thank and who we embrace as American, especially those who have served in our country. And I think that she offers this family where each figure actually responds to this threat in a different way. Some are scared, some are defiant, and some are proud. And so I think this really speaks to, although this is a figurative family, I think it speaks to kind of the larger family of the Latinx community, but also the larger family of all of us as American citizens.
One of the works in the exhibition here is by Mira Thompson, these 3 pieces on the wall here. And I know Mira for a number of years, so my particular take on seeing Mira's work in this exhibition is actually much more of a personal nature. Anyone who knows Mira's work is familiar with the incredible vibrancy of the color that conjures emotions and ideas of landscape and the power of music coming together. But here what we're seeing is something very different, and it really is a testament to someone who, an artist like Mira, is responding to the political crisis of the time. Rather than relying on the power of abstraction and color, what she's doing here is relying on the power of word, the text, and not finding the right words because of the levels of frustration that can come from feeling oppressed in a kind of political scenario like we see here. This particular work in the middle is called Words Fail Me, and it's a collage of 4 individual panels in which she quite literally tore apart a dictionary trying to find the right words to convey the frustration in which she felt at the time. And in creating a collage, it looks at first like it's a chaotic mess, which one could argue in the current political situation there seems to be a lot of chaos on a daily basis. But in fact, when you look closely at the actual collage, what is amazing are the individual words that stand out. Words like wrongful, charlatan, scandalous. These are words that demonstrate that even though she struggles as an artist to find the words to convey her emotional angst, she's still able to find those words and convey them in a sort of way that you need to look deeper to actually see them. And as a result, the collage comes together in a beautifully composed grouping of 4 individual panels that are framed quite beautifully to convey that out of this chaos there really can be order when we find the right words to say how we feel.
I am not a political person in any way, and certainly in my paintings, the ideals that I'm looking for, I think, would be ones that we all share and have been mentioned this evening, our quest for an expression of our common humanity. But the moment that Trump was elected, I really felt that we as artists had to do something in light of the kind of attacks that this administration had been visiting upon the press and journalists. And so I felt that I needed to do something that would cause me the kind of discomfort and pain that I assumed that journalists were feeling. So my first impulse was to take one of my own paintings and destroy it, to make a collage out of that. I'm teaching collage right now. And I just couldn't bring myself to do it. So I looked around for other things that I cherish. I adore books. I particularly love dictionaries. So I went out and I bought a copy of the Oxford English Dictionary, a very attractive little copy, and proceeded to rip it up. And the words, it sort of leapt out at me. I chose words that were consistent with what I was feeling. I think the difficulty, and Robert has talked about this in his statement, I think the difficulty for an artist who wants to make a political statement is how do you stay true to your own standards and training as an artist, and this was something that concerned me, especially since I do teach collage. So the problem was how do you express something that is ugly without making something that is beautiful, which is usually my project. So this collage is called Words Fail Me. I think Roberto has talked about this in a way that is more insightful than I can. My other two pieces, as I worked on this, the vitriol or the outrage that I was feeling was not being exhausted. So I worked on what I would call a computer-generated collage, and in the middle of this grouping of words, if you read downward, it says, make America great again. And I really wanted to turn that campaign slogan inside out in terms of what it must represent as a dog whistle to Trump's followers. So I called this piece The Tower. And then I still wasn't finished. So I did another computer-generated collage, which was really inspired by Roberto. Roberto had told me that he does not say the president's name anymore. So I took a list of all of the things I think we could all say we cherish and value and seek in ourselves and in our leaders, and anytime the letter M, P, R, T, or U appeared in any of those words, I excised those letters and put a question mark in instead, and to make a clear reference to who I was speaking about, I printed this out on orange.
I was really moved by the way culture was brought into the Obama administration. My favorite things to watch on TV were the performances at the White House. The Kennedy Center Awards were like the joy. And it's never going to happen like that again. We're never going to have another Obama, and in fact, this may never occur again. So this is my inspiration for this piece. And this piece is called Golden Shores, and that's what people believe when they come to America, that they're going to find gold and opportunity and embrace, or will be embraced by the government and by the people. And instead, what they find is a wall, a fence, get out, stay away, and this is my expression of that.
This work by Ronnie Sherman Ramos really spoke to me when I came to the opening. There's a lot of color in the room, and these two works, in fact, are sort of in a grayscale, and it really sets the tone for the mood of her work, The Party's Over. It's a smaller, more intimate piece, kind of abstract at first, and then you sort of notice the hand, and you realize we have bodies moving and dancing. the party's over, which means we're sort of at this liminal moment where, we've just been having this amazing, in this case, 8-year run of the Obama administration, and someone's about to turn the lights on. And in this case, light is not necessarily representative of something happy and uplifting. We're about to see the true, stark glare of reality coming down to us. This is just like our last sort of moment where you really don't want everything to end, but it has to at some point. So do you stay while the lights come on, or do you quietly slink off into the night and go to bed? And I felt like this was something that you could really sort of relate to, and again, sort of be intimate with.